"You have been giving me poison the whole time." Hitler's furious words to his doctor, Theodor Morell, in the final days of the war rip open a secret the world was never meant to know. Morell hide a truth darker than anyone imagined. Now, the terrifying secrets buried in Morell's notes have finally come to light, and the revelations will make you question how much of history was written not by men, but by needles. The darkest secret. For years, Adolf Hitler's personal doctor, Theodor Morell, was known only as a shadowy figure who followed the Führer everywhere. He had served Hitler faithfully from 1936 until the very last days in the bunker. At first, he was just the physician who eased the dictator's stomach cramps and soothed his constant digestive troubles. But as time passed, he became much more than that. Morell was no longer only a doctor. He was the man who controlled the substances flowing into Hitler's body, and the one who kept him going through the chaos of war. When historians later dug into Morell's diaries and medical notes, the truth that surfaced was disturbing. The records are haunting. Morell himself called Hitler Patient A. In those private pages, he carefully recorded the endless stream of injections and tablets he administered. Analysis of his records shows that Hitler received 800 injections and varying medications, 1,100 pills, in just under 4 years. That is nearly a dose every single day, sometimes multiple times a day. These were not simple remedies. Historian Norman Ohler explained in one interview that Hitler's drug abuse increases significantly after the fall of 1941. This was the turning point. Before then, Hitler had relied mostly on vitamins and stomach remedies, but when the war became harder to fight, Morell began turning to far stronger substances. The list is chilling. You would be shocked to know what was given to him to keep him awake and to force him to sleep. At first, these injections gave Hitler what seemed like bursts of energy. He felt sharper, steadier, and ready to face his enemies. But the dark secret was that every boost came at a price. Morell's miracle cures carried hidden side effects. Behind the grand speeches and the fiery eyes, Hitler was withering. His body was hollowed out, his mind clouded, his strength a shadow built on chemicals. Every injection was another lie, another mask hiding the reality that the master of Europe could not even master his own veins. And only one man held the secret. The doctor who fed his addiction and wrote it all down in cold, clinical lines of a diary. By the last years of the war, Hitler's once commanding presence had changed. The man who had hypnotized crowds with his voice was pale, restless, and sickly. This was the darkest secret. The dictator who appeared invincible was in truth a fragile figure propped up by drugs, trembling under the weight of withdrawal, chained to a physician whose cures dragged him closer to ruin. It is a revelation that still sends a chill down the spine. Now that we've laid bare the addiction, let's go back in time to see exactly how Morell won Hitler's trust and the first small miracles that led to this nightmare. From obscurity to Hitler's inner circle. In 1936, Adolf Hitler was already a powerful man, but behind the polished image he presented to the world, he suffered from constant stomach cramps, gas, and painful digestive troubles that no doctor had been able to fix. The Führer who commanded armies was, in private, weak and uncomfortable, often doubled over with pain. Into this picture walked a doctor who was far from famous, a man with a questionable reputation and unconventional methods. His name was Theodor Morell. Morell was not admired by Germany's top medical professionals. Many considered him sloppy, arrogant, and too experimental with his treatments. But when he first examined Hitler, he offered something no one else had: a quick fix. Morell prescribed Mutaflor, a preparation made from intestinal bacteria, along with anti-gas pills that contained strychnine and belladonna. To boost Hitler's strength further, he added a mysterious powder called Vitamultine. The results came fast. Hitler's cramps eased, the bloating lessened, and for the first time in years, he felt real relief. The dictator's gratitude was immediate and overwhelming. Hitler declared, "No one has ever told me precisely what is wrong with me. Morell's method of cure is so logical that I have the greatest confidence in him. I shall follow his prescriptions to the letter to Hitler." Morell was not just another physician, he was a savior. Not long after, he told those around him, "What luck I had to meet Morell. He has saved my life." With these words, Morell's position in Hitler's circle was secured. Almost overnight, he went from being a doctor on the sidelines to one of the most trusted men in Germany. He was given a place in Hitler's home, invited to meals, and allowed constant access to his patient. This closeness gave Morell a level of influence no other doctor could match. He believed that unconventional remedies could restore energy and extend health. For a time, Hitler accepted it all eagerly, convinced his doctor had the answers. But the cost of these treatments soon began to show. The quick fixes became a routine. The daily injections were no longer a special cure, but a necessity. Hitler began to expect that each time he felt weak, Morell would produce another shot to lift him up. Other doctors in Hitler's circle grew alarmed. They whispered that Morell's anti-gas pills were dangerous, that the strychnine inside them could be poisoning the Führer. They questioned why Hitler looked more bloated, more pale, and more restless as time went on. But Hitler brushed aside every warning. His trust in Morell was absolute. This was how an obscure doctor mocked by colleagues stepped into the heart of power and gained control over the body of one of history's most feared men. The early cures had opened the door, but what lay beyond was darker than anyone could have imagined. But as the war grows darker, what seemed like medical victories turn into experiments. Let's now expose Morell's hidden prescription cocktail and its truly dangerous components. The cocktail of the Führer. By the early 1940s, Dr. Theodor Morell had turned Hitler's body into a battlefield of chemicals. What began as vitamins and stomach remedies soon grew into something far more dangerous. Morell's bag was never without its syringes and bottles, and Hitler rarely went a day without an injection. The list of substances he consumed reads like a catalog of desperation: hormones, animal gland extracts taken from bull prostate and animal liver, steroids, sedatives, opiates, and stimulants. Hitler's body was no longer being treated. It was being kept afloat by an artificial storm of drugs. Morell was secretive about his methods. He often refused to explain to other medical staff what he was giving the Führer. Nurses and assistants recorded their confusion at the strange concoctions he administered, but they knew better than to question him directly. Morell guarded his notes fiercely, and even in his private diaries, he disguised Hitler's identity as Patient A. He was determined to remain indispensable, the one man who knew exactly which mix of drugs could keep Hitler moving from one day to the next. The historian Norman Ohler later described the turning point. He said, "In 43, the third phase starts, which is the heavy opiate phase. By then, Hitler was not only dependent on injections, but was slipping into deeper reliance on powerful painkillers. Dolantin and Eucadol, both strong opiates, became part of his regimen. Each injection lifted him into a temporary state of energy, but the crash afterwards left him irritable, paranoid, and increasingly fragile. Those around Hitler noticed the changes. His once fiery speeches became broken by pauses, his hands sometimes trembled uncontrollably, and his mood swung violently. At times, he was euphoric, filled with bursts of energy and confidence that pushed him to make reckless decisions. At other times, he sank into despair and suspicion, snapping at those closest to him. His body, though still hidden behind the image of power, was weakening. His internal organs were struggling to cope with the flood of chemicals. His skin became clammy, his face paler, and his weight fluctuated. Behind closed doors, Morell continued to assure Hitler that everything was under control. He kept feeding him new combinations of injections, claiming they would strengthen him. The bull prostate extracts, the liver solutions, and the endless vitamins were all part of what Morell presented as cutting-edge treatments. But in reality, Hitler's health was collapsing under the strain. The more dependent Hitler became, the more irreplaceable Morell seemed. It was a dangerous bond. Hitler saw him as the only man capable of keeping him alive and functioning, even as that very dependence was pulling him deeper into decline. The drugs may have propped him up for meetings and rallies, but they also fed his paranoia and clouded his judgment at critical moments of the war. What began as a cure had turned into a trap. Hitler's mind and body were being consumed by a chemical cocktail that blurred the line between relief and ruin. These were powerful drugs, but were there hidden illnesses that Hitler was hiding all along? Let's tell you about the suppressed diseases, cover-ups, and the physical decline that Morell tried and sometimes failed to mask. Hidden illnesses, cover-ups, and physical decline. By the middle of the war, Hitler's body was no longer just weakened by the drugs Dr. Theodor Morell pumped into his veins. Beneath the surface, other illnesses were spreading, ones that neither Hitler nor Morell wanted the world to know. His well-known stomach cramps were only part of the picture. Observers noticed his hands trembling more often, a sign that suggested Parkinson's disease. After the July 20th assassination attempt, the bomb blast left him with permanent ear damage and constant ringing that only added to his torment. His teeth, already weak, caused him severe dental pain, and years of clenching his jaws in stress had only made matters worse. The strain of leading a war that was turning against him amplified it all. Hitler was under crushing psychological stress, unable to rest properly, pacing through nights, unable to trust even those closest to him. His body was falling apart, but instead of easing his pain, many of Morell's treatments made his conditions worse. There were others who saw the danger. Dr. Erwin Giesing, one of the few physicians to get a closer look, raised alarms about the so-called anti-gas pills Morell gave Hitler daily. Giesing tested them and discovered they contained strychnine and belladonna, both poisonous substances in the wrong amounts. Instead of helping the Führer, these pills may have been slowly poisoning him. But Hitler refused to believe anyone who spoke against Morell. He dismissed their warnings and clung to the one doctor who promised relief. Witnesses described the terrifying fits that would overtake Hitler at times. Hitler would go as white as a sheet, tightly clench his jaws. These fits always followed by an order to dismiss or execute somebody. His physical suffering and his paranoia fed each other in a vicious cycle. Each spasm, each trembling hand seemed to ignite a burst of rage that often ended with someone's life destroyed. His illnesses were not hidden from those around him, but they were carefully disguised from the outside world. What the public saw was still the image of a strong leader, but behind closed doors, his health was crumbling. Morell tried to mask these problems with ever more injections and pills. When Hitler's ear pain grew unbearable after the bomb blast, Morell added new concoctions. When the trembling worsened, he promised his treatments would keep it under control. He adjusted dosages, increased injections, and layered one drug upon another, as if sheer quantity could keep Hitler functioning. But the more he tried to cover up the decline, the more obvious it became. Hitler's body sagged under the weight of chemicals. His skin grew pasty, his movements stiff, and his once sharp voice often cracked. The cover-ups were meant to protect Hitler's image, but they could not change the truth. The dictator who had demanded absolute power was being eaten alive by disease and by the very medicines meant to sustain him. And yet, Morell remained by his side, the only man trusted with the task of keeping him upright, no matter the cost. Now, let's see how the mind was altered, the psychological manipulation, mood swings, delusions, perhaps even hallucinations, what Morell really did to the Führer's will. Psychological manipulation under the scalpel of medicine. By the height of the war, Hitler was no longer the same man who once mesmerized crowds with fiery speeches. His strength, his energy, even his voice had dulled. The effect of medicines was devastating. Historian Norman Ohler explained it simply. He needed those highs to substitute for his natural charisma, which he had lost in the course of the war. The drugs replaced what time, stress, and illness had taken away. Crowds still saw a leader standing tall, but behind that image was a man dependent on chemicals to appear strong. Without them, he was pale, trembling, and withdrawn. As the doses grew, so did the changes in his mind. Witnesses reported paranoia that went beyond the usual suspicion of a dictator. He distrusted his generals, doubted their loyalty, and lashed out at anyone who dared question his judgment. Critical voices were silenced, not through debate, but through dismissal or worse. Some even whispered that Hitler saw things that were not there, that hallucinations blurred his judgment further. Every injection tightened Morell's control. Every pill tied Hitler's will closer to his doctor's hand. Morell's power grew quietly, but steadily. Hitler relied on him in moments of weakness, and Morell became indispensable. Other doctors tried to intervene. Karl Brandt, once trusted by Hitler, warned that the treatments were harmful. Dr. Erwin Giesing also raised concerns, pointing out the dangerous contents of Morell's anti-gas pills. but their words fell on deaf ears. Morell's constant presence and endless assurances drowned out every warning. Hitler refused to part with the one man who promised immediate relief, no matter the cost. What made this bond so dangerous was that it was not simply medical. It was psychological. Morell shaped Hitler's reality, deciding when he would feel energy, when he would collapse into rest, and when his pain would be dulled enough to continue. The Führer's body was trapped, but even more terrifying, so was his mind. Decisions that changed the course of the war were made in these altered states, under the cloud of drugs. It was no longer just politics and strategy at play. It was chemistry. The dictator who once prided himself on iron will was by then a man ruled by injections. His empire may have seemed vast, but his own freedom was shrinking to the small glass vials in Morell's hands. The battlefield was not only in Europe, it was inside his veins. Hitler's mind and body were altered, but what about the ethics, war crimes, experimentation? Let's take you through the horrifying medical boundary crossings Morell may have committed. Experiments, ethics, and atrocities in the shadows of the bunker. Medicine in Nazi Germany carried a shadow that went far beyond healing. It was twisted into a tool of power, cruelty, and control. Across the Reich, doctors became instruments of atrocity, conducting horrific experiments in concentration camps, carrying out sterilizations, and overseeing euthanasia programs that claimed thousands of innocent lives. The authority of medicine was bent to serve ideology, and in that darkness, Dr. Theodor Morell carved out his own peculiar role inside Hitler's bunker. Morell did not run death camps, but his practices carried their own form of ethical corruption. He misused powerful substances without any real caution, gave endless injections and pills without explaining the risks, and hid the side effects whenever they appeared. Hitler trusted him blindly, but trust was not the same as informed choice. Each syringe carried a hidden price, one that Hitler paid with his body and his mind. Morell also engaged in questionable dealings, such as the way he secured penicillin through channels that were far from legitimate. Even as the Allies advanced, he continued to push experimental treatments, claiming he could keep the Führer strong. The reality was far different. His concoctions left Hitler more dependent and more broken. Morell's influence harmed not only Hitler, but also those around him. When other officers fell ill, his diagnoses often missed the mark, and his treatments brought more risk than relief. His reputation among the inner circle sank steadily, but Hitler shielded him from criticism, at least until the very end. In those last desperate days inside the bunker, even Hitler's faith began to waver. The man who once called Morell his savior now saw him as another source of betrayal. Eyewitnesses recalled the chilling moment when Hitler snapped at him, "You think I am crazy? You will try to give me morphine. Get out of here. You are sacked." The words ended years of trust in a single breath. For Morell, it was the collapse of the strange power he had held. For Hitler, it was the shattering of the illusion that his doctor could keep him alive. It was a cruel irony. Morell's entire career had been built on keeping Hitler propped up, masking decline with injections and pills. Yet, when the end approached, the same man was cast out, accused of plotting to drug the Führer into submission. What remained was a dictator broken by illness, paranoia, and chemical dependence, left without the one doctor who had been at his side for nearly a decade. The story of Morell inside the bunker is not just about one man's medical malpractice. It is a mirror of the wider corruption of medicine under the Nazis, where healing was twisted into harm and science was turned into an instrument of control. The price of that corruption was not only measured in Hitler's decline, but in the suffering of countless others across the Reich. As the war collapses and Hitler's health disintegrates, what happens in those final days reveals the true cost of Morell's secrets and the dramatic confrontation that changed everything. Final days, confession, and legacy. By April 1945, the walls of the Reich were crumbling, and so was the body of its leader. Adolf Hitler, once the fiery speaker who could command a crowd of thousands, was now a shell of himself. His health had deteriorated beyond concealment. His hands shook violently, his movements were stiff, and his eyes seemed clouded with both exhaustion and despair. To make matters worse, the steady stream of drugs that had carried him through the war was running dry. The Merck plant, which supplied many of the substances Morell relied upon, had been bombed. Supply lines were severed. Without his daily injections, Hitler's body spiraled into withdrawal. Tremors worsened, pain grew sharper, and his mind slid further into paranoia. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere was suffocating. Hitler raged against his generals, blamed betrayal for every defeat, and clung to the idea of some final miracle that would never come. It was in this state that he turned against the man who had stood by him longer than most of his inner circle, Dr. Theodor Morell. In a sudden outburst, Hitler confronted him with words that cut through years of dependence. "You have been giving me opiates the whole time," he shouted. He accused Morell of drugging him, of weakening him, of plotting against him. Then came the dismissal. "You think I am crazy. You will try to give me morphine. Get out of here. You are sacked." For Morell, it was the collapse of everything he had built. Cast out of the bunker, stripped of the strange authority he had enjoyed, he fled as the Reich fell apart. But his escape brought no redemption. Soon after, he was captured, interrogated, and imprisoned. His health, already poor, collapsed. He never returned to medicine, never reclaimed the reputation he had once sought. He died a broken man, remembered less as a healer, and more as the personal doctor who fed a dictator's decline. History has struggled with the question of how much influence Morell truly held. Some argue that Hitler's drug dependency distorted his judgment, making him reckless, paranoid, and unstable at crucial moments in the war. Others suggest that while the drugs weakened him, his ideology and decisions would have been just as destructive without Morell's syringes. What remains certain is that one of the most feared men in history had placed his trust, and much of his fate, in the hands of a doctor who mixed science with secrecy and ambition. The story leaves behind a haunting lesson. Medicine, when twisted from its purpose, can become a weapon. Dependency gives power, not to the patient, but to the one who controls the remedy. Even the most powerful can be undone by hidden weakness, and even the mightiest empire can rest on the fragile foundation of a single vial. Though Morell is dead and Hitler gone, the echoes of this secret still haunt us. What if similar dependencies lie hidden in other seats of power? What truths are still buried? Share your thoughts in the comments.